Assalamu alaikum. This is another episode of Network Reorient. Today we have with us Samayya Afzal and Claudia Radiven, who will be speaking on the topic of prevent and schools. The Prevent strategy first spawned in 2003, but following the 7/7 London bombings, in 2007 it was rolled out by the UK government with the broad and somewhat vague objective of stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism, and found itself expanding beyond the criminal to focusing on the pre-criminal, identifying those potentially vulnerable to falling prey to being radicalised and doing what it says on the tin, preventing this from happening. The Home Office has boasted of the programme's success, claiming to have thwarted terror and rescued thousands of people from the predatory grips of extremism. And yet there has been a great deal of concern as to how the strategy has been enacted. Academics, human rights groups, students, teachers, and members of the Muslim community and beyond have raised concerns over the Prevent strategy, arguing that it unfairly and indiscriminately criminalises, stigmatises and pathologises the Muslim community. This in turn has now led to the government recently appointing Lord Carlisle to lead an independent review of Prevent, the results of which should be delivered to Parliament by August 2020. So here with me today to discuss the Prevent strategy and particularly how it's enacted in schools are Claudia Radiven and Samayya Afzal. So welcome to you two. I'd like to begin the episode by just asking each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and to talk a little bit about how your work involves scrutinising the Prevent strategy in general. So if I could come to you first, Claudia.
Thank you very much. My PhD has largely looked at the Prevent strategy, but more broadly at de-radicalization in the UK as a whole, with particular emphasis on how Prevent has been used as an extension of past forms of colonial governmentality, so the idea of managing bodies, managing the citizenry, and how these policies of management are inherently Islamophobic, and far from de-radicalising groups, Prevent can actually potentially be a radicaliser, particularly looking at the methods of pre-crime and so on that you mentioned, and essentially just how this policy, it's not doing what it's set out to do, it's doing quite the opposite. And it also has a very detrimental effect on communities, as you pointed out, stigmatising them, continuing to encourage people to racialise Muslims, which in turn doesn't just affect Muslim groups, it affects other BME communities, particularly Sikhs, Hindus and so on. From a specifically academic approach, also looking at some of the statistical evidence from Freedom of Information reports and so on.
Yeah. Thank you. And Samayya?
Yep, so I work for the Muslim Council of Britain. I am currently running a national listening exercise with Muslim communities all over the UK on their concerns and views on what should change around the national counterterrorism debate. And obviously Prevent is a very, very big part of that. Because it's one of the strands that people have the biggest connection to, or at least have heard of it. So that's my interaction with the policy at the moment. But when I was a student, I co-founded the National Student Campaign against the Prevent strategy being rolled out within universities and public sector bodies in 2015, which was called Students Not Suspects. So we had a strategy to come together with lots of different groups, so like teaching unions, for example, and we looked at the application of the policy and how it would impact freedom of speech, freedom of association, and in general the ability of Muslim students to be at universities, at further education colleges, and exist purely and simply. So, whether they were in the Islamic Society, whether they were in their lectures, whether they were in their accommodations, what were the kinds of challenges that this policy would bring. So that's what we campaigned against. And then following on from that, we kind of realised that there were a number of problems within the policy itself and how it would impact Muslims more generally.
Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit more about the national listening exercise that you've been doing? I know you're still in the process of collating all the information you've got, but any sort of first thoughts on what you found so far?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways in which Muslims engage with the topic at hand. So counterterrorism is, I think, it can be viewed as sometimes an inherently stigmatizing topic in and of itself. You know, people will criticize and actually challenge why do Muslims need to run a listening exercise on this topic in the first place. Terrorism or counterterrorism is by no means solely a Muslim problem or a solution that Muslims have to come up with themselves. Right. This is the job of the government. But what we wanted to do was try and figure out a way to first of all get past the impasse that seems to have been created over the last 4 or 5 years. So that there's polarization, there's pro-prevent, anti-prevent. And there's a constant kind of playing out of those dynamics within national media, within policy and think tanks and how the government decides to deal with this problem, and this kind of leaves a lot of Muslims, everyday Muslims, feeling as though if they get involved in the debate, they will be stigmatized. If they don't, they will have no recourse to try and change things. So what we tried to do was get beyond that. And really encourage Muslims to get involved. I think there's what that has shown is the way that this debate often happens, very behind closed doors. People don't necessarily want to openly share their opinion, and also sometimes I think people just completely want to remove themselves from the conversation. So that there's been a lot of different responses.
Sure. Claudia, you mentioned something about prevent being, not doing what it's supposed to do on the tin, what it says on the tin, and you talked about it being a means of actually radicalising Muslims, doing the opposite of what it intended. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, if we look historically at other sort of pre-crime policies, so one of the most obvious ones that comes to mind is stop and search. Stop and search had the effect of essentially mobilising the youth to be more anti-police than they would have previously been. And obviously stop and search has been applied not just for things like drugs or knife crime, but also in terms of counter-terror legislation. And far from sort of making people feel safer, making people feel like something's being done, it had the effect of making people feel like they were being profiled, like they were being targeted on the basis of race or appearance. Which, evidence has come to light subsequently of sort of the systematic racism in the police to show that this is in fact correct. Statistics have shown that the people that have been stopped and searched are disproportionately from minorities rather than this sort of broad approach that this is a policy we're applying to everybody. Also, sort of looking at the ways that it has been a radicalising force. When we look at the kind of people that are targeted for prevent, it's disproportionately Muslim males between the ages of 18 and 35 who are considered the most risky group. And it has this, the phrase is self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are constantly targeting a particular group, making them feel like they are a problem, making them feel like, this issue that we're facing now, this is, the problem of your particular community, you have the end result that you are going to mobilise people towards the fringes. That's how any kind of extremism, radicalisation works. The more that you target this particular group, you are going to push them to the fringes where they feel like they can express themselves safely or in any way. For example, when you have people being referred through Prevent for wearing Free Palestine bracelets, far from encouraging people to be more moderate, it's going to have the opposite effect. If you keep stamping on particular groups, you're just going to push them into a different arena rather than making them feel more included. So in that sense, it has this sort of the opposite of its intended effect. If in fact we are buying into the idea that, the whole intention of Prevent is to be, de-radicalising, to stop this problem, and it isn't a policy of management, which I personally think it is.
Okay, so obviously we've looked at sort of Prevent more broadly within the work that you're doing, and and criticisms abound about the strategy and how it's being taken up, and the future directions in which it seems to currently be going in. And Claudia, you've talked about the specific age range of young Muslim men that seem to be targeted by the strategy. Prevent being a state tool, it therefore has a long reach. It has the long reach of the state behind it. One of the institutions within which it operates quite nefariously, for want of a better word, is within schools. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding around how it operates. There doesn't seem to be much transparency, certainly from the perspective of many parents who are often caught blindsided by it. So I think that it's quite important that there be some discussion around that, to just allow for clarity on this. So for today, I really wanted to focus on how Prevent operates in schools, be that primary, secondary, or beyond, and what are the key issues that critics have identified around the specific application of Prevent within schools. Samayya, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, so I think that for schools, there has been a lot more focus on wrapping up Prevent within safeguarding.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is something that really no one can argue with. You know, if you want any policy to be successful, you need to kind of frame a problem and then say that this is the solution, and the protection of children is something that's clearly very, very important to everyone. So it's sometimes difficult to even start to have that conversation about why is there Prevent in schools. And then secondly, I think also then the kinds of conversations that a teacher that is trained by Prevent or is under the obligation to report, you know, young children who may be kind of showing behaviours that they think are, you know, from a spectrum of like subversive behaviours to, you know, what they think is considered extreme, to go ahead and report them. There's a very kind of there's a very hostile climate in which that's occurring. So there is, I think, as has been demonstrated by like polls and stats across the board, incredible levels of Islamophobia across society, and nowhere do you see that more than within the state policies and institutions. So I think that there's a huge focus, a hyper focus on Muslim children and Muslim parents, their involvement as governors, their involvement within the education of their children, and also then their I guess the techniques or the other ways in which they raise their children. So this kind of bringing in a Prevent to take over the discussions around anti-racism, anti-extremism, all of these kinds of discussions and workshops that may well have happened before, that kind of it comes in with that lens, this idea that there is something inherently different about Muslim children and the way that they the language that they use, the kinds of traditions or things that they are used to, that there is something different, and they are to be treated differently if they make mistakes or if they say stupid things. So I think that there's that, which is, I think it's really important to kind of get a grasp of that when you're looking at how many children are referred and how many children eventually, after being referred, actually go through the channel process.
Do we have an idea of sort of how many children are being referred through Prevent? What's the process? So, and what are the processes that they go through?
I haven't sort of got the statistics for this year. When I first started looking at this around 2015, it was, again, the majority of those referred by a long stretch are Muslims, usually males, and it's the age range, sort of obviously quite a lot in school, but also 18 to 35. But within that percentage of people referred, again, it's an overwhelming majority of cases that are subsequently dismissed. So having been referred and having gone through the first stage of the process, it's then found that actually this was unnecessary. But it's a bit like when people are falsely accused of things like sexual assault, just because you said, oh, we've dismissed this now, the stigma attached to these offences doesn't just disappear now that you've said it's dismissed. That, particularly if you think in schools, I mean, people often say, you know, children can be the cruelest. The stigma attached with those accusations don't just disappear. That'll stick with the child. And there's been examples in the press of kids who have been, one particular example actually, a child was talking about eco-warriors in a French class and used the French word for eco-terrorism. And because he'd used the word terrorism in French, he was referred, and having been a very gifted student in languages, he's now subsequently dropped them and won't pursue them. And whilst this seems like something quite isolated, one of the key problems with Prevent in schools is it encourages this form of self-regulation.
Right.
So as much as we don't want people to start shutting down and not discussing things where they have to be discussed, it's going to create the atmosphere of a lack of trust in an environment where kids are supposed to be able to trust those around them. They're supposed to be in school to develop, not to be assessed for their potential as you know, the next Osama bin Laden. And you have a problem whereby teachers, the training available isn't particularly clear. It's quite vague. I did one of the training courses online that was one of the top recommended ones, and it took me 14 minutes to do. You cannot possibly train somebody through a PowerPoint presentation in 14 minutes to recognise what makes a radical and what doesn't. The training was very poor, it wasn't very consistent, and it played very strongly into these racist tropes about, you know, this Eurocentric idea that because Muslims are different, they are problematic. And the other problem, at the point more recently with Prevent 2 as it's called, where it became less of a suggested thing to implicate, it's now incumbent, it's you know, it has to happen.
Right.
As if teachers aren't under such an incredible amount of pressure as it is, with you know, constant decreases in funding, increased pressure, too many kids in classes. They're already under immense pressure, and you're now going to pluralise policing so that they're responsible for that as well.
Right.
This is not their job, and they are not being trained adequately to carry it out. So all you're going to have is this constant marginalisation of children. You're encouraging other children to see these kids as different. And, you know, we've got these ridiculous examples of 3-year-olds being referred because somebody misheard them say terrorist house and decided that meant they live in a terrorist house. As if a 3-year-old understands what that is. Or as if anyone would trust a 3-year-old with that information, more to the point. It's just, it's become, if it wasn't so serious, if it wasn't very detrimental in how it affects people, it'd be laughable.
Yeah, I think the figure is up to 95% of all cases that are reported are not eventually referred to channel. I think there's a couple of different reasons for that, though. You obviously have to have it's an optional it's considered an optional procedure, that there are people who you know, upon further kind of either research or conversation, they realise that obviously the child is not the problem, that the family is, or there's some other kind of influence. So there are kind of lots of ways in which that body of like 95% of cases is dismissed. But I think that's probably one of the most dangerous parts, because there are kids who are having to go through the stigmatizing process, or kind of had their knuckles rapped and said, you know, you've said something wrong, or you've done something wrong, or you think the way you think is wrong, and that's going to impact, you know, how they then understand themselves, their identity, and their place, whether in their school or within society at large. So I think that's really important to note as well, that we kind of focus very heavily on the cases that are referred and whether they merit referral, but actually the ones that are actually dismissed beforehand, there's probably a huge amount of work to be done there as well.
I mean, it's the irony, isn't it, that the Prevent strategy is set up as you know, safeguarding children, as you said, Samayya, that often shuts down the opportunity for any debate, because who wants to debate a policy that's put in place to safeguard children? But when that very same policy is enacting a trauma upon children who are then going to grow up to be adults who have, you know, suffered that trauma and continue to, as Claudia said, suffer from the stigma attached to that trauma, then it's paramount that strategy is scrutinised and criticised and open for debate. And on that, I think it'd be. I know, Claudia, you've given some examples, but earlier in the year, the Guardian published an article on this exact issue, the alienation of Muslim school children, as a result of the strategy being enforced by poorly trained teachers who, let's not forget, are also human beings affected by the the current Islamophobic climate in which we are living. So Samayya, you work with the Muslim Council of Britain. I was interested to know if there are any sort of cases that you've come across of how children have been affected and how families have been affected by Prevent in school.
So I can't share details.
Sure.
But this is one of the major concerns that we've had from a lot of parents. We've had a lot of kind of there's been a huge amount of media attention at the moment on Muslim parents and their choices with regards to their children's education. I think there's been in the context of that, one of the reasons why, for example, the Birmingham LGBT education row that's been going on has been taken on so strongly by Muslim parents. And this is not to kind of express an opinion for or against, but just to say that the way the segment was packaged as an opportunity for the school to deliver under its obligations under Prevent was a big problem. And I think that again, that footing of kind of where young Muslim children or Muslim parents are in society, I think that continuous questioning is something that's really impacting people's kind of their understanding of themselves, their understanding of what kind of life they can have in this country as well. So you do have kind of debates and discussions on, what next, it's what kinds of battles are we going to have to fight next.
Sure. I think it's really shocking for a lot of sort of second generation Muslims who were born here, who went through the educational system, who are very much at home here, who are now parents themselves, and seeing that their children are no less marginalised or exceptionalised, otherised than they were. And in fact, in so many ways, it feels worse because it feels like it's coming. It's institutionalized now. Before it was just playground bullies, but now it feels like when you have a strategy that is in place that is training teachers to act as, some sort of proxy for government surveillance of children, it's really alarming for parents. I think what I found, certainly talking to, just amongst my own social group of Muslim parents, we're often caught unawares by it. There doesn't necessarily seem to be a lot of awareness as to how the policy is how it operates within schools, and so when a complaint comes home about a child and some misdemeanor that's happened at school, you're not really sure, okay, is my child being scrutinized extra because because of their Muslim heritage, religion, or there's a sort of gaslighting, I think, that goes as well. We second guess ourselves, and so what I'd like to wrap up today with is, how can parents be more aware of how their school engages with Prevent, and what are practical steps that concerned parents and teachers can take?
I think that there has to be some sort of balance, so you can't end up in a situation where parents are telling their children, you mustn't talk to any teachers, you mustn't engage with them at all, because you end up falling into this trap of self-regulation where you've got a whole community and their children who are terrified to speak on anything, and this is where it's become, I think, most detrimental. And it's not just in schools, it stretches to academia, to postgraduate academia, where you have people that don't want to engage in debate and don't want to interact in the academic process at any level because they are terrified that what they say will be misconstrued or will be viewed through a particular lens, and they'll end up being referred through this policy. And certainly the risk for younger children, and the fear for parents is that social services become involved. If you're deemed to be raising a radical child, your child can be taken off you. And we've seen some of these ridiculous examples. It really doesn't take much to be referred. And I think that there has to be a balance whereby kids understand, and parents are educating their children, parents are educating themselves to understand that there are these risks, and that they need to understand how the process works, and ultimately how to avoid becoming embroiled in it, without ending up in this sort of business of being secretive and self-regulating to not talk at all. And I think that there has to be that fine balance struck. In terms of how to do it, we discussed among ourselves a sort of a more informal approach rather than going to specific bodies for advice and so on. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Samayya.
Yeah, so I think this entire debate has opened up kind of more kind of small micro debates around what are some of the challenges that children are facing within schools anyway. You know, there are so many different things that the pressures that kids are under, whether that's through exams and the kind of the whole attainment aspect, whether that's, you know, the sexualization of young girls and pornography within schools, whether that's bullying and racism and all of these other things that children are facing. I think that there's a real need for parents to be much more open with their children, and kind of really find out more about what's going on within their lives, because I think that sometimes that disconnect allows there to be, you know, sometimes a way for parents to kind of be really separated from their children's experiences in school. So I think that's really, really important. But then also those kinds of informal networks between parents, because as you've mentioned, Prevent, you know, is a policy, it's an indication, it's a suggestion at the end of the day, for individual institutions and organizations to adopt, and then for them to deliver it in the way that they choose. So that's kind of based on their own resource and their own capacity. Some will lump it in with safeguarding. They will try and make it. Some will make it, you know, different. So it's different in every school. So I think that it's up to parents, and it's up to people who are interested in this to really find out exactly how it operates. You know, 9 times out of 10, I would say that they would be open, and then really find out about how you can try and change that. How can you resist some of the ways in which your children are targeted? So I'd say, yeah, parental networks, get involved with schools. I know that there's a huge outcry now whenever Muslims join anything. But when I was younger, Muslim parents were always encouraged to join as governors, to really take an active role in the education of their children. I think that we shouldn't let the climate completely separate us from that. So I think, yeah, really, really important. Know your stuff. Know exactly what's going on in your local context. Build links with the parents of the children in your child's school, but also other schools as well in the area as well. And then you can reach out to different organisations, and you can touch base. You can sound off ideas. You know, you can look at what's already been done within the higher education sector. And see what works. So I think that there's a lot to be done. I think we just need to kind of try and make sure that we know what's going on before we're campaigning on it.
So I'm going to push you a little bit more on that, in terms of you know, if there are Muslim parents listening to this and they're thinking, okay, I need to get clued up on this, where do they go? Because if you do a Google search on Prevent, you'll get a dictionary definition of what Prevent means. Or you'll get, you know, sort of government sites on what Prevent is about, which I suppose is a starting point. But for if you want to know how to challenge it, or what are the problems, maybe there are parents listening going, well, what's the problem?
Maybe they think that there's no problem. So I think that like I said, you know your own context better than anyone. So if you think that there's a problem, or if you're worried about your child in a school where they are really kind of either aggressively like training all the teachers on Prevent and looking out for all of these kind of really minor sometimes incidents, where a child uses it as a word, a child is bullying, or a child is exhibiting some kind of, I would say, like, behaviors that are within the normal realm of what you would find in a school. So I think that anyone who feels that they're in that situation, find out as much as possible, and then come to your local organisations that are there to help. So the Muslim Council of Britain is a national organisation, but you're more than welcome to get in touch and tell us about what's going on there. We have been looking for people to get involved in the listening exercise, fill in our survey, send us an email about your experiences, so that we can, when we represent and advocate on a national stage, we are able to really fully scrutinise the policy and say this is the impact that it has at the grassroots. There's no point in a policy being as diverse as it can be, or having gone through many reviews, if it's actually being completely counterproductive where it matters. Absolutely. Then that's not a policy that's fit for purpose. So if you are also someone who has faced some of this kind of behaviour, then also you can take part in the national review that's happening on Prevent. It may not be perfect, it may not be something that it may be led by someone who has intimate kind of connections with Prevent, but we need to kind of use anything as a vehicle to publicise just how damaging it is. Right. So to use that as well. So that there are lots of different avenues that you can take.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Samayya. Thank you, Claudia.
Thanks.
This has been another episode of Network Reorient. Thank you for tuning in. I have been your host, Sophia Rahman. Please have a listen to some of our other episodes and leave a rating.